Deuxième session de la matinée. Many years ago, can't remember if I was a student or starting out, and sometimes you go to conferences and you sort of wonder, do I really want to do this in life? Do I want to spend so many decades doing this? And there were two talks I heard that made me decide, yes, this is something I want to do. The first one was by Fernando Notenbaum, who discovered the function of the passerine songbird nuclei. And the second talk was by Mike Ryan. So he's a fantastic speaker. What he does is truly integrative. That's the name of his department. And what he does represents truly integrative biology. So you're in for a treat, Mike Ryan.
Thank you very much, Louis. Is it possible to turn the lights down a little? I will take that as a no. Can we turn the lights down a little? Yeah. Just in case anyone needs a nap.
Do you prefer like this?
That's good. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for the intro, Louis. And Stephen, I don't see him here. I just want to thank him. Oh, there you are. And I want to thank you again for the invitation. It's very much appreciated. So we start to think about the brain. And if you were to ask most folks, both scientists and non-scientists alike, they would assume that the brain has evolved to obviously acquire information about our environment, social and asocial, biotic and abiotic, and give us a very realistic perception of the world around us. But that's not really so. If you were to ask an evolutionary biologist, she would tell you that that's certainly not true, that our brains evolved under selection to somehow increase our Darwinian fitness. So thus, consequently, as any neurobiologist would tell you, our brains give us a very biased perception of the world around us. Now, I think nowhere are those biases more important. Nowhere do they leave more of a footprint than in the context of mate choice. Now, mate choice is a very important decision-making process because it generates sexual selection, and sexual selection is the selection force that's responsible for this amazing amount of biodiversity, where usually males are evolving these sexually beautiful traits, which are also usually quite dangerous for the males, to attract females. So if we really want to understand how sexual selection works, then we really need to understand how choosers, in most species females, but not all species, how choosers perceive beauty. Because the females' mate choice drives all this sexual selection that generates all this spectacular biodiversity. And Darwin really appreciated how important it was to understand the neural and the cognitive bases of sexual preferences, of mate choice. And he even referred to animals having an aesthetic sense, which he thought was quite similar. He even suggested homologous to aesthetic senses in humans. And by this statement, what Darwin is suggesting is that it's very important for the males, teleologically, to be able to reach into the brain of the females and try to coax the females into mating by stimulating certain parts of the brain that will make them appear more beautiful to the female. So we often talk about beauty being in the eye of the beholder, but really we need to think about beauty being in the brain of the beholder. And again, it's the brain of the choosing sex that generates a lot of this spectacular diversity. And and we haven't understood this for a long time, but interestingly, Picasso understood this when he painted Girl Before a Mirror in the 1930s, where this girl is looking at her reflection, and what this picture depicts is the person's biased perception of her own image. And Picasso asks, who's really seeing the human face here correctly? Is it the painter, the girl in the mirror, a photographer? So he had a very good understanding about perception of beauty. Now, even though we've been studying sexual selection for quite a long time, we've only been really understanding how important it is to understand the brain and to integrate the brain into the evolutionary studies of sexual selection. Since this has only been going on since the 1980s and 1990s. So we've been trying to understand how these neural and perceptual and cognitive biases in animals can drive the evolution of these beautiful traits. And we've been doing this for quite some time, and we've been doing this by studying sexual selection and communication in a frog. And frogs, as Echo suggests, frogs can be fascinating, but in a lot of cases, you really need to study them for a long time before you understand what's going on. And that's what we've been doing with these frogs. This is the Tungra frog, Physolemus pustulosus. And I started studying these about 30-something years ago on Barrow, Colorado Island in Panama. And Barrow, Colorado Island is a wildlife refuge that's part of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. So I've been working in Panama for many years with Strive, where I'm a research associate, and they've been supporting this research for quite a long time. So I need to give you a little background about frog biology, then a little bit of background about these frogs. So Tungra frogs are found throughout Middle America. They get into South America. They're found in the Magdalena Valley in Colombia. They spill out onto the Great Plains, the Llanos of Venezuela, and then some of them creep up onto the Guiana Shield. And the northern extent of their distribution is just north of Veracruz, Mexico. And we've studied these frogs from northern Mexico down to Venezuela. We've surveyed 30 different populations of the frogs along this 5,000-kilometer transect. And what I'm going to tell you applies not only to where we do most of these studies in Panama, but all the other populations that we've studied, obviously, though, to a much lesser extent than the ones we studied in Panama. So these frogs congregate in small temporary pools during the rainy season, which in Panama is from about May until December. And the males advertise for mates, and the females come to the breeding site and they choose mates. Now there's about 6,000 species of frogs, and almost all of them call. All of them make conspicuous long-distance mating calls. And all of those calls are different from one another. So as with birdsong, it's very easy to go into the forest or into a field in the tropics, and you can identify 10, 20, 30 of species of frogs by their songs alone. But it's the mating call of this Tungra frog that makes them very interesting. So I'll show you a little video of a male calling. I want you to try to pick up on the variation in the call types as they're calling. So these frogs have a call with two components, and as you see in the bottom left, with oscillograms on the top and sonograms underneath. The first component of a call is a whine, and it sounds like this as you've heard. Yeah. And all calls have to have a whine, and some calls only have a whine. And the whine is both necessary and sufficient to attract conspecific females. And as I'll mention in a second, we understand how the brain is wired in frogs in general to make the females find conspecific signals more attractive than heterospecific signals. Now, these guys can also add chucks to their calls. and all males can facultatively add chucks. So I'm going to play you these calls that we see on the bottom left. So we'll hear a whine, and then a whine with 1 chuck, a whine with 2 chucks, and a whine with 3 chucks. Now, when males are calling in the field, if a male's calling by himself, he produces only a whine. So if a male's calling, yeah, yeah, and if I go up to the male and if I say to the male, yeah, then he responds, yeah, and then if I say, yeah, he says, yeah, and it's not, I mean, I've been working with the frogs for a long time, but anybody can do this. It's very easy to imitate their calls, and you can get the males to add chucks. Now, they can add up to 7 chucks, but they usually are making calls with 1, 2, or 3 chucks. But they need this vocal competition to drive them, to make them, to encourage them to add chucks. So why are the males adding chucks? Well, an obvious hypothesis seemed to be it makes them more attractive to females. So a lot of the experiments that we do with these frogs are phonotactis experiments. We collect females in the field, and we bring them into our lab in Panama. It's dry. I think it's better if we have dark back, maybe. Yeah. And
like this.
Yeah, it's still a little bleachy, but. So we can bring the females into the lab, and we can present them calls. I'm going to be talking about mostly binary choice tests, but we give the females a choice between one call and another call, and then the females will hop right up to the speaker and make contact with the speaker, and this indicates mate choice and indicates mate preference. So one of the first experiments we did was asking if if females are more attracted to calls with chucks than calls without chucks. And we'll refer to these calls with chucks or complex calls, calls without chucks are simple calls. So we've tested the females over 5,000 times, over 20-something years. And what we see is that there's an 85% preference for a whine chuck over a whine. And if we look at the strength of this preference from 1997 to 2015, we see that the strength of sexual selection, or more specifically, the strength of this mate preference is consistent in direction. They always prefer the whine chuck to the whine. And it's also very strong, and it's also very consistent in its strength. There's obviously variation, but the strength of the preference stays very high. So an 85% preference translates to a 5-fold preference. So this is a pretty amazing phenomenon because it does not take any energy. We've measured the aerobic energy needed to make these calls. And calling is energetically very expensive, but not to add the chuck. It doesn't cost anything to add the chuck. And we know a lot about the biophysics of the larynx. And these frogs have evolved a mass that hangs from the vocal cords. And appropriately enough, it looks like a testicle. And it's so large, it's jammed back into the connection with the lungs. And it's this fibrous mass that's responsible for the chuck. And we now know through bioengineering models, we now understand why you don't really need any more energy to make this. And it's an amazing organ because what it does is it generates sine wave variations that are moving right up to the border of chaos. So we're right at the threshold of this mass going from making harmonic sounds to aharmonic noise. And it's been pushed, we think, as far as it can go, where it can still generate harmonics. So that's this call. Now, one of my good friends, Walt Wilczynski, and I have been studying the neural basis of these preferences, combining electrophysiological studies with gene expression studies. A lot of the gene expression studies were done with a postdoc that Walt and I had, Kim Hoke. And we have a very good understanding of how the mating call is processed from the inner ear through the various auditory nuclei in the hindbrain to the hypothalamus, and then to the forebrain where motor responses are generated. So we understand a lot about the neural bases of these preferences. So we can really point to the brain and tell you where the preference for the chuck emerges. We can also point to parts of the brain where the males and the females differ in the way that they process these signals. But what we've become very interested in, and what I'm going to talk about today, are these cognitive aspects of mate choice. So we've been doing a variety of these studies over the years, and I'm going to talk about, only have time to talk about 3 of them here. And we're going to talk about how females make comparisons between males, specifically in preference for chuck number. We're going to talk about multimodal communication and the interaction of audio and visual signals, and how this can fuel the evolution of novel emergent preferences. And then we're going to talk about what in economic theory would be called irrational choice. So when females are choosing mates, or vice versa, when males are choosing females as mate, there's almost always comparisons that are going on. So we know that these males can add a large number of chucks to their calls, and we know that females seem to be comparing the males, listening to a whole variety of acoustic parameters, but especially the numbers of chucks. So to think about how animals might be comparing mates, we can think about how we do some comparisons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 2 clusters of dots. And what I would like you to do is raise your left hand if you see more dots on the left, or raise your right hand if you see more dots on the right. The only constraint is, though, that you can't cheat. And in this case, cheating is actually counting the dots. Okay, so we want kind of a Gestalt impression. Okay, so as soon as you see the dots, you should make that decision. More dots on the left or on the right? Okay, almost everybody got it the first time. So there's one more. There's one more. See, I'm counting now. There's one more dot on the left than there is on the right, and that's the absolute difference. And then the proportional difference is about 20%. Okay, let's do it again. Okay, so now some people are getting it wrong, and there's also a longer latency to decide. And again, we see that there is one more dot on the left, but the proportional difference now is 0.08. Do it one more time. Okay, now almost everybody got this wrong. So again, there's one more dot on the right, and the proportional difference is 0.02. So a lot of variation in sexually selected traits are quantitative. The illuminance of a red badge on a bird's wing, the length of a bird's tail, the speed at which animals might dance. So it's to understand how selection might be driving the evolution of these quantitative traits, it is important to know how animals make quantitative comparisons in nature in general, but from our interest, especially in the context of mate choice. So what we see in humans, in a lot of cases, certainly not all of them, when we compare quantities, we are comparing ratios. We're not comparing absolute differences. And this hypothesis was suggested by Weber in the late 1800s. It's a very famous study in psychophysics, and then it was elaborated by Fechner. Sometimes this is called Weber-Fechner's law. And the idea here is that there's a constant K, which defines a just noticeable difference between 2 stimuli, and K equals delta I over I, where I is the magnitude of the stimuli. So what this shows is that as stimuli become larger, the absolute difference between them needs to become greater for us to define a just noticeable difference. Now, in these studies of mate choice, we're not necessarily looking at just noticeable differences. We're looking at what Nelson and Peter Marler called just meaningful differences. But we want to know if Weber's law applies to this just meaningful differences. So we did a series of experiments where we gave females choices between calls with different numbers of chucks. And our hypothesis is that if the females are making absolute comparisons, comparing the numbers of chucks between the absolute numbers of chucks between two stimuli, then, for example, the strength of the preference between 6 and 5 chucks should be as strong as the strength of preference between 2 versus 1 chuck. On the other hand, if they're doing ratio comparisons, i.e. if they're following Weber's law, then the strength of the preference between 2 and 1 should be much stronger than the preference between 6 and 5. So we did a whole variety of these experiments. And when we look at the results, what we see here is on the y-axis is the proportion of females in each set of experiments, and the sample sizes are usually 40 to 50. The proportion of females that preferred the call with more chucks. So if we plot this, that's our proxy for the strength of preference. If we plot the strength of preference versus the difference in chuck number, we see that that relationship does not explain a significant amount of the variation of the female responses. However, if we take those same data, but if we plot the strength of preference as a function of the ratio of the numbers of chucks, what we see is this. Now this explains more than 80% of the variation among experiments, and it also follows Weber's law very predictably. So what's going on with this mate choice? Why are females using proportional comparisons versus absolute comparisons? And there's two general hypotheses. One hypothesis is honest signaling. And one possibility is that the difference in male quality between males that are making 2 chucks versus 1 chuck might be much greater than the difference between a 6 chuck call and a 5 chuck call. It might be, if chuck number was related to quality, it might be that once males are able to add 4, 5, 6, 7 chuck, they're all of very high quality, and the small difference between them might not be important in mate choice. However, between 2 and 1 might be a much more telling comparison. An alternative hypothesis is what we refer to as cognitive constraints. Female tundra frogs make these comparisons based on ratio because they're vertebrates and they have a vertebrate brain, and this is how vertebrate brains make these kinds of comparisons, even though we know that they don't have to. So we tested the honest signaling. We tested the honest signaling hypothesis with a number of data sets that we had, and we didn't find any support for that hypothesis. Now, with any adaptive argument, you can always think of another way, another adaptive advantage that the females might be getting from this. But we tested all the ideas that we had data to test. So how would one test this cognitive constraint hypothesis? Well, ideally, it would be nice if there were another animal that listened to the frog's call, another animal that found chucks attractive, and another animal that was making these comparisons, but in a different domain where mate quality wasn't important. So this is a bat in Panama, the frog-eating bat, Trichopterosis. And many years ago, myself and Merle and Tuttle discovered that these bats eat frogs. They eat other animals, but they really concentrate on frogs. And they home in on the frog's mating call. We've done studies of the neuroanatomy of the inner ear of these frogs, and they have adaptations that expand their hearing range from the ultrasonics down into the sonic range where frog calls are. They respond to calls very much like female frogs do. If you give them a whine, the bats will fly to the speaker. And we've done these experiments in the forest, and the bats will come out of the canopy and fly right over the speakers. But usually for more controlled experiments, we do these experiments in flight cages. So we knew that like the females, the bats prefer whine chucks to whines, even though they would be attracted to just a whine. So we wanted to know if the bats compare numbers of chucks. When we started this study, we didn't know that if bats would prefer more chucks to fewer chucks. We just knew they would prefer complex calls to simple calls. So we did these studies with bats. This is Rachel Page, who's a staff scientist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And Rachel studies these frog-eating bats full-time. So we did the same experiment. We gave the bats 2 speakers playing calls that varied in the number of chucks. On the top right-hand graph, we see for the bats that the absolute difference in the number of chucks does not predict the strength of the female preference. But if we look at the bat's response as a function of the ratio of chucks, not only are they following Weber's law, but they're following a Weber's law almost to the precise extent that the frogs are. So these 2 functions, these 2 Weber functions, are statistically not distinguishable from one another. So what we see then in both cases is that there is selection for males to add chucks, but the strength of that selection decreases with the more chucks that the animals are making. So we've suggested that the fact that they're using ratios, that they're following Weber's law, this is putting a cognitive constraint on the evolution of this sexually selected trait. We know in many cases, especially with these wines and chucks, that natural selection acts against elaboration of traits because they're also often very costly. And not only do bats use the calls to feed on the frog, but there's a small fly that also goes to these calls, and they suck blood from out in the nares of the frog. They land on the male's back, crawl around, go inside, suck bloods from the capillary. And the flies are also attracted to calls, and the flies also prefer calls with chucks to calls without chucks. So we always known there's been a natural selection cost to arresting the evolution of these elaborate traits. But now we think that there can also be a cognitive cost. And just in some very simple simulations that we've run, what we show here is preference for an arbitrary trait, the size of an arbitrary trait. And we show that if females are following a Weber function, as opposed to having a strength of preference where they can discriminate size 75% of the time versus 100% of the time, everything else being equal, the magnitude of these traits are going to evolve much more slowly when animals are doing this sort of comparison. So we know how frogs and we know how bats make these kinds of comparisons. So you can't help to wonder, well, what about humans? So we have a study that where we finished collecting the data and we're finished the analysis, but we're still not actually finished the manuscript yet. But we did this paper with face preferences. And the folks who I work with on this, unfortunately, you can't see the name. The lead author is Jeff Gasson, and Sarah Hill is his advisor. Sarah Hill was an evolutionary psychology student at where I am at University of Texas. She worked with David Buss, and Sarah and I did some studies with fishes when she was a graduate student. But we use this, I say we, I didn't do it. Jeff Gasson used this computer program where you can morph faces into one another. So you identify an attractive and an unattractive face, and then you morph them. We morph them in 10% intervals. And then you give people choices. And we did this with women faces asking men. This is with men's faces asking women. We asked them which traits that they found, which faces they found more attractive. And if we analyze the data as we did with the frogs and the bats, we also see that in these facial comparisons, it appears that people are making decisions based on proportional differences rather than absolute differences. The second topic I wanted to talk about was multimodal communication. And just like the studies of Weber's law, our studies of multimodal communication were motivated by studies of humans. And a number of years ago, there was a very interesting paper published in Nature by McGurk and McDonald, where they explained a perceptual phenomenon that we refer to now as the McGurk effect. So with the McGurk effect, they have a video of somebody pronouncing phonemes. So there's a close-up of their lips, and they'll be pronouncing pa or da or ba. But the sound that you're hearing is not the sound of the phoneme that the lips are pronouncing. So as we see here, the video would show these lips pronouncing ga, ga, ga. The sound that you would hear coming from the video is not ga, ga. It would be ba, ba, ba. And interestingly, we do not hear either of those phonemes. And we don't hear a compromise between those phonemes, a hybrid. What we hear is da, da, da. And it's a really striking phenomenon. There's lots of examples of this on YouTube. And it works, and it's a very important phenomenon. Now, we know in humans that we can lip read, and some people rely on lip reading without any audio input. But we also know that lips did not evolve to send information about human speech. Lips evolved for a variety of reasons, but in terms of speech, the function of lips are to modulate the waveform of the sound generated by the larynx as it leaves the mouth. So in that sense, our ability, when we extract information from the movement of the lips, we're extracting information not from a signal, but from a cue. That distinction, I don't think, is very important. Just the point that we know that lips didn't evolve under selection to generate lip reading. Now, frogs don't have lips, but they have vocal sacs. So with most frogs, when they call, the vocal sac expands, and then at the end of the call, it contracts, sending that air back into the lungs. So we have negative pressure breathing. When we breathe, we move our diaphragm, we create a pressure differential between the lungs and the environment, and air comes rushing in. But frogs don't have a diaphragm. They have positive pressure breathing. So they basically have to swallow their air in order to inflate their lungs. So the vocal sac, we're pretty sure, evolved to facilitate calling in the frogs. We're shuttling this air back and forth so the same air can be used. But you can see the vocal sacs. And when you're looking for frogs at night, quite often you can hear them. Sometimes with small frogs, you can even get close enough to feel the call against your skin, and you still can't find them until, bam, you see the vocal sac moving. So it is a good indication that there's frogs calling. So with these folks in the upper right-hand corner, Ryan Taylor, the person in the middle, when he was a postdoc, we developed in my lab robo-frogs. And we made these little plasticine models of frogs and then put a vocal sac on the frogs. Now, there's a public service announcement. We first tried doing this with condoms. And after like 2 inflations, they would break. So just keep that in mind. So what we then did is we used urethra catheters, and they last much longer. They last much longer. Period. I'm not suggesting that you switch from condoms to catheters, though. I don't think that would work. So what we can do is we can slave these robots to the acoustic output from the computer when we're testing the females, and these vocal sacs will inflate along with the call. And we see pictures here. The photos on the bottom are robo-frogs. The photos on the top are real frogs calling. So we see that these models are pretty good mimics. So the experiments that we do are quite simple. Instead of having these speakers 180 degrees apart, we now have them 45 degrees apart. So as the female is approaching the call, a robo-frog is always in their visual field. So when we started to do these experiments, one thing that we almost always do, if we're doing experiments, we're testing hypotheses based on previous data, then we usually go back and redo those earlier experiments. And that's one reason why we've tested this wine chuck phenomenon 5,000 times. So we redid the preference for wine chuck versus wine. And as we almost always do, we got about a 0.85 preference for wine chuck. Then we gave the females a choice between two wine chucks. And there was a robo-frog in front of one speaker, but not in front of the other speaker. And when we do this, what we see is that the visual cue of the inflating vocal sac enhances the attractiveness of that call to the female. So the females are more attractive to the audio-visual combination than they are to just the audio signal itself. In fact, even though these plasticine models of the frogs are so beautiful and so realistic, you can take the frog away and only have the vocal sac, and it makes no difference to the females. They just need to see this vocal sac inflating. If the vocal sac is inflated and static, it doesn't influence the female's preference. So it has to be inflating and deflating, but it does not need to be attached to a frog. And we're doing these under the same light conditions that the frogs experience in nature. Okay, so now we reflected on some audio experiments we had done before, where we wanted to know how the females were perceptually grouping the wine with the chuck. So what we showed is you can move the chuck in many positions, from right in front of the wine, throughout the wine, to right behind the wine. And in most, not all, but in most of the positions, it doesn't matter to the female. They would still find that call more attractive than just a wine. And you can move the chuck away from the wine. But once you get out past about 300, 400 milliseconds, then that chuck no longer enhances the attractiveness of the wine. So in audio scene analysis jargon, you would say there's no perceptual grouping of the wine and the chuck at that point. So we wondered how dependent the female was on the temporal relationships in the audio-visual signals. So we gave the females a choice between a wine chuck, where the vocal sac inflation follows right away, right after the call, as opposed to being synchronized with the call. And what we showed is that the females are no longer perceptually grouping the vocal sac inflation with the call. In fact, what's interesting is when the vocal sac inflates after the call, it actually makes that multimodal signal less attractive than just the audio signal. The main point is that it certainly doesn't enhance the attraction. So then we started thinking about perceptual grouping again, and we started thinking about a phenomenon that Bregman, who's at McGill, in this beautiful book that he wrote on auditory scene analysis many years ago. It's been a real inspiration to me over the years. We wondered if there was what Bregman calls continuity illusion in these frogs. So I'm going to what is auditory continuity illusion? Well, in this graph is showing, this illustration is depicting 3 tones on the top that are separated in time, and then white noise that can be played in between these signals. So I'm going to play this sound for you, and first we'll hear the tones, then we'll hear white noise building, and then, at least for some of us, it doesn't work for everybody, at some point, you will hear the tones become continuous and glide right through the noise. So I'm going to play it now. I hope it's loud enough, because it doesn't work on low volumes, but we'll give it a try. And if you hear, if and when you hear the tone gliding through the noise, just raise your hand, okay? Yeah, certainly not everybody, and it is due to the volume. But still, I mean, I do this enough that it doesn't work on me anymore. but the volume does have to be larger. So that's auditory continuity. Now it ends up that the Tunga frogs actually don't show auditory continuity. But now that we're looking at this multimodal communication system, we thought, well, might there be something more complex that could happen? Could there be not multimodal perceptual illusion? So we did these experiments where we took two signals, two audiovisual signals that we knew were unattractive. So we have the wine with the displaced chuck. We know that's not attractive. They perceive that as a wine. Then we took the wine followed by the vocal sac inflation, and we know that that doesn't make the call more attractive, it makes it less attractive, actually. So we gave the females a choice in these first experiments, the second from the bottom, wine, vocal sac, chuck, versus just the wine gap chuck. So we're asking, if we fill in this gap with a visual cue, will it result in perceptual continuity by the females? And the answer is that it does. So this is a combination of audiovisual cues that these females have never experienced in nature and through their entire lineage. But what we see is that there's this emergent, what we call a hidden preference of females for this particular kind of signal. A whine, then followed by a visual cue, and then followed by a chuck. And that restores, that rescues, in a sense, this displaced chuck, and now makes it, now it's perceptually grouped with the signal and makes the signal more attractive. Then we wanted to know, well, how much more attractive is this whine, vocal sac inflation, chuck? So we did these experiments below. You can't actually see them, but we took this same stimulus and compared it to a whine chuck, and which again is always 5 times more attractive than a whine. And now what we find is that their attractiveness is equal. So our conclusion then is that the linking of these otherwise non-salient acoustic and visual stimuli rescues the effect of some of the signal components and restores signal saliency. And then in doing so results in what we've been calling hidden preferences. And hidden preferences are preferences that animals have in our studies for sexual traits that don't exist. So it's a preference that we usually don't see when we test animals with natural stimuli. But when we probe their perceptual landscape, we see that it's mined with all of these other preferences, which if males were to evolve those traits, they would immediately be favored by females. Okay, so the last topic I'm going to talk about is thinking about this mate choice in a slightly more complex way. So we often use the metaphor of females being in a sexual marketplace, especially in lekking species where males gather together to advertise for females, and then the females get to pick and choose. So if we start thinking about sexual marketplace, I mean, we're obviously making an analogy to human consumers and how human consumers might be making choices. We can ask some basic questions about how choices are being made in this sexual marketplace. So one assumption of marketplaces in standard economic theory is that our comparisons are transitive. So in this case, if frog A is preferred to frog B, and frog B is preferred to frog C, then we assume, if they're transitive, that A is also preferred to C. Another important assumption is called regularity. And regularity states that the strength of the preference between A and B, be it a frog or be it a can of beer, is not going to change in the presence of C. So that's a second important assumption of economic theory. So transitivity and regularity. Now we know, especially with the emergence of the field of behavioral economics a number of years ago, and a younger field now, neuroeconomics, we know that humans don't always follow strict economic theory when they're making these kinds of choices. And there's a wonderful book written by Dan Ariely about 10 years ago called Predictably Irrational, where he reviews this field of behavioral economics, including a lot of his studies. And one study he did that illustrates quite nicely this idea of regularity. He polled students at MIT, asking them if they were offered 3 subscriptions to The Economist, and this is how The Economist was organizing its subscriptions, which one would they pick? So they could have the online subscription for $59, the print subscription for $125, or the print and the online subscription for $125. So we surveyed the students at MIT, and these are smart kids. So nobody chose the print subscription for $125 when instead they could have both the print and the online subscription for $125. So then he surveyed a second group of students, and he removed this option of the print subscription. So you would think nobody wanted the print subscription anyway, so you think the results would be quite similar, and they're not. When print subscriptions are left out of the choice, the same population of students showed a much stronger preference for the online subscription than they did for the print and online subscription. So what this shows is that these consumers are they're violating the principle of regularity in making these choices. And in this case, the print subscription by itself would be called a competitive decoy because it's influencing the choice between 2 otherwise superior choices. So we asked a while ago, my graduate student Amanda Leah was part of her PhD thesis, are Tungura frogs rational when they're choosing amongst individuals? And we took 3 natural calls for which we knew the relative attractiveness of these calls to these males, a study done 10 years prior. So then we redid that study, and we showed that 10 years later, the preferences of the females for these 3 different call variants was almost exactly the same as it was 10 years prior. So the more attractive calls are, in this case, are called A and call B, and the least attractive is call C. And the attractiveness was measured along 2 dimensions. One is the acoustic attractiveness of the call. So based only on the call properties, that's dimension 2. And on dimension 1 is the call rate. So if you take a relatively unattractive call and you play it faster, it becomes more attractive to females. If you take what would inherently be a more attractive call and you present it at a slower call repetition rate to females, it becomes less attractive. So we started these experiments by giving females just a binary choice, and we would rotate the calls between these speakers, between call A and call B. And what the results showed is that there was not a significant preference for one call over the other, but there was slightly more females preferred call B than preferred call A. Amanda then repeated that experiment and included call C in the mix. And even though call C was rarely responded to, what we see is that there's a flip in the females' evaluations of A versus B. Now in the presence of C, call A becomes much more attractive than it was when it was only in the binary choice. So what this shows then is that when females are making these kinds of comparisons, they can be, their evaluation of calls that are attractive can be influenced just by listening to an unattractive call. So what we're showing is that there are competitive decoys in these frogs that influence mate preferences, very much as there are with human consumers. Now, this really makes evolutionary models of the evolution of mate preferences very complex. This and the fact that we have some evidence that these frogs aren't totally transitive. So when you violate these two assumptions of transitivity and relativity, it now becomes a bear to try to model how female preferences might influence the evolution of male traits, because what this shows is that the females aren't exhibiting what economists will call strict preferences, again, because they're violating some of these critical assumptions. So what these three studies show, as well as other studies that many other researchers have done, is that perceptions of perceptual beauty are clearly influenced by biases in our sensory organs, the colors we see better, the sounds we hear better, the smells we sense better. It's also influenced by cognitive processes in the brain, how all of this information and stimulation is put together to motivate decisions. But we also see that it's more difficult to understand how these decisions are being made when we put them in a more complex social environment, and when animals are making decisions based on proportional rather than linear choices. And as I said before, it also causes some serious problems for ultimate studies that model sexual selection, assuming strict preferences. So it's really not quite clear how to forecast the influence of mate preferences on the evolution of sexually selected traits. I think the only thing that we could argue at this point is that all of these processes probably are important to generate the diversity of sexual beauty that we see, but it's become difficult now to clearly define what Darwin called the taste for the beautiful. And we argue that the only way to really understand this taste for the beautiful is by viewing the traits that are chosen in sexual encounters, not just through the eyes, but through the brain of the beholder. Now, I want to stop, because that's usually where I'm done. Given the topic of this workshop, I wanted to go on a 5 or 8 minute tangent that's kind of unrelated to what I was talking about. So last month, a famous novelist, Tom Wolfe died, and he was 88. And Wolfe was responsible for the birth of new journalism. He influenced a lot of people like Hunter S. Thompson. And he had a number of very socially important novels. The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, where he followed Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters around in their van as they were all doing acid, and his very important book for documenting some of the excesses of the 60s. He wrote The Right Stuff about the Apollo program, and then his most recent good book was Bonfire of the Vanities, which unfortunately was made into a horrible movie. So Wolfe wrote some very important books, and he also wrote some real losers. One of the losers is a book called Hooking Up, which is just very banal. It's a horrible book, but his real loser is the last book that he published, in my view, called The Kingdom of Speech. Now, I'm hoping that very few people have read this book, because I'd argue it's hardly worth reading. But in this book, Wolfe attacks, as only he can attack, two very prominent scientists. One is Charles Darwin, and he presents Darwin in a horribly negative, from a horribly negative point of view. And then the other person he goes after in the second part of the book is Noam Chomsky. So this is how his book starts. He's surfing the web. This is page 1 of chapter 1. He's surfing the web one night, and he comes across this paper that's entitled The Mystery of Evolution. So if we read the next paragraph, it says, it seems that 8 heavyweight evolutionists, linguists, biologists, anthropologists, computer scientists, had published an article announcing they were giving up, throwing in the towel, folding, crapping out when it came to questions of where speech, language comes from and how it works. Then if we go to the end of that page, the most cutting insult, he says, now this was odd. I've never heard of a group of experts coming together to announce what abject failures they were. So this is the paper that he's talking about, The Mystery of Evolution, that a number of us published in, I think in 2014. And we're all, most of us are in very different fields. And what we said in this novel, in this paper, when we reviewed a lot of the data, suggesting that we understood the progenitors of human language, when we reviewed a lot of those data, we found them lacking. So what our conclusion was, it's really hard to identify progenitors of human language right now. We really don't completely understand how human language and speech came to emerge from our ancestors. But that's not really a failure, because one thing that Hauser and Chomsky and Fitch suggested in a 2002 paper in Science, that instead of studying animals expecting to find retarded speech patterns, we should take human language and we should decompose it into some fundamental components. And we should then ask, do these fundamental components exist in closely related species and even more distantly related species? So at what point do we find that animals are capable of recursion? At what point do we find that animals have a theory of numbers, or even yet a theory of mind? So I certainly don't want to, I'm not going to end by saying all that much about human speech. Just want to say that we shouldn't be afraid as scientists, and speaking for myself, especially as evolutionary biologists, when we can't explain every single small step of the evolution of a complex trait, because it's a very complex problem and we don't have all the answers to the complexity of nature. So the types of things that I talked about here, I also kind of have expanded this view of the importance of the brain in trying to understand sexual beauty in a book that I had come out earlier this year, A Taste for the Beautiful. So this is just a shameless promotion of this book. So I just wanted to thank a lot of the organizations that have supported this work over the decades: Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, National Science Foundation, University of Texas, and then especially the scores and scores of interns and undergraduates that have helped myself and my grad students doing this research over the last now 35 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. We have about a half hour for questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I found the bat data really interesting. I'm trying to conceptualize what's going on there. So to my mind, it's analogous to a predator of bowerbirds, whatever that might be, selecting more attractive bowers.
Yeah.
So how does a sexually selected trait become a predatorily important trait? I'm wondering if perhaps, for example, could it be that the chucks are providing additional chucks provide better directional information to the bats and localizing the frogs, or is something else like that?
Yeah, and the answer is yes. Yeah, so the bats are very good at localizing sound, not quite as good as barn owls, but they're good. If we measure the accuracy with which they can locate a whine versus a whine with chucks, if we do that in a flight cage, they can localize both of them very well. But if we introduce background noise from the forest, or if we introduce an obstacle course that they have to navigate as they would in nature, then what we see is the bats can locate those sounds better, the complex calls better than the simple calls. But this isn't just a special case, because if you think about sexually selected traits, if a frog calls in the forest and the females can't hear him, did he actually make a call? Is there actually a sound? So in almost all communication, but especially in attracting mates, being teleological, the first goal of the courter is to make himself stand out from the background noise. Whether we're talking about forest noise, whether we're talking about colors that decorate a bower, and also when we're talking about interacting with other conspecifics from the viewpoint of the courter, that's also noise. So there's very strong selection for almost all of these courtship traits to contrast with the environment. Mm-hmm. Well, when you contrast with the environment to communicate with the intended receiver, in this case, a chooser, usually a female, you can't, there's all these eavesdroppers, visual and auditory and olfactory eavesdroppers about, and most animals are not communicating in a very private channel. So I think it's sort of a general problem. Mm-hmm. And it's one that perplexed Darwin. When he was working on sexual selection theory, he wrote a letter to a botanist in North America, Asa Gray, and he said, every time I look at a peacock's tail, it makes me sick. And that's where this, it wasn't physical, it was cognitive dissonance. He had just worked out this beautiful theory of natural selection, and now he finds all of these traits that clearly don't promote survivorship.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike. I guess the female frogs are aiming at finding the biggest males to mate with, as it would give them the best chance of having a maximum of eggs fertilized, I assume.
Right, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that the female frogs did not need to see the frog, and only seeing the sacs were enough to drive them towards the source of the sound. So I was wondering if you had compared the degree of inflation of these sacs to see if there was a correlation between the inflation of the sacs and the size of the frogs, the male frogs. In other words, is there a cue other than the sound that helps the females figure the size of the frog? And can they only guess that based on the sound of the chucks?
Yeah, we don't yet know the correlation between vocal sac volume and male body size. We're doing that now. It's this is an excuse, but it's complicated because it's a three-dimensional object. But we're in the process of measuring that now. We have, though, tested females with vocal sacs that we can vary the degree to which the vocal sac inflates. And at least over the range that we've tested it does not make a difference. Our guess is this is scotopic vision that the frogs are using at night. So the spatial resolution under low light levels using only your rods is usually pretty poor. So we think that it's probably not providing a lot of reliable information about body size that the females can glean from these signals. But when the males get larger, the dominant frequency of their call, both the whine and the chuck, decrease. And we know that these females, as well as a variety of other species of frogs, prefer males that are making lower pitched calls. And for the Tungura frog, we know that's because the tuning of the inner ear, frogs have two inner ear organs, we only have one. One of them is tuned to the dominant frequency of the whine, and one is tuned to the dominant frequency of the chuck. But with the chuck, there's a bit of a mismatch that the larger males can better stimulate that inner ear organ with their lower frequency calls than can the smaller males with their higher frequency calls.
Would you have an explanation as to why humans would prefer baritone voices over soprano voices?
Well, it's hard to get approval to do experiments with humans. So it's a lot of it's speculation, but certainly male pitch is related to sexually mature males. So when males grow up, when androgens start to circulate at puberty, there's androgen receptors on the larynx and even on the vocal folds, and they all increase in size. And then as a function of increasing in size, then they vibrate at a lower fundamental frequency. So one possibility is that not now, but at some point in our ancestors, this was one way to discriminate between males and between females. And we know there's a lot of work like this going on in zebra finches, where they look at the beak color, and we see that as zebra finches are developing, they use the mother's and the father's beak color as an indicator of what later on will be a male and what later on will be a female, except they show character displacement, so they actually prefer the extremes. So that's would be my guess, but that's just a guess, that's just speculation.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. In humans, the high presence of masculinity traits that women seem to prefer is not necessarily correlated with the actual quality of the sperm, of the fitness quality of the man. So, is the capacity of a frog to whine and chuck and their capacity and their ability to do it, is it an actual indicator of genetic fitness or their reproductive quality?
Well, I would just be a little bit careful in the way that you use the term fitness, because we often talk about females surveying males, looking for the most fit male. Well, in terms of Darwinian fitness, the females don't find out who the fitter males are. They decide. If a male mates with a female, he just became fitter. But if we use the term fitness, meaning physical fitness and survivorship and viability, with the Toomger frogs, there's not a lot of evidence that there are genetic correlates for survivorship. In some other animals, there are surprisingly few. There are few animals, given all the years of study that have gone into it. But yeah, with the Toomger frogs, we don't find any example of that. What we're doing now is we're looking at overall physical condition and also immunocompetence, and to see if that's influencing the numbers of chucks or the acoustic quality of the chucks. And at least so far, what we're finding is it has an important influence on call amplitude. And call amplitude is very important in making the males more attractive. But we have no evidence of good genes, selection. In fact, when I was a graduate student, Amat Zahavi, the person who suggested the good gene hypothesis, he was in Panama and I was showing him the Toomger frogs. And he said, oh, those males that are in the pond calling that haven't been eaten by the bats. So they're the males with the good genes. And I said, well, Amatz, how do you tell the difference between good genes and good luck? And it's a very difficult hypothesis to test. I'm not saying that makes it wrong, but it's a difficult one to test.
So just make sure I understand. So the better the immune system, the more amplitude the vocal signal will get?
That's what the data seem to be suggesting at this point. This is an ongoing study.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for your amazing talk. As an ethnomusicologist and working with a paradigm of hunting, I'm very interested about the predatory experiment you did. And I was wondering if the decoy experiment was having the same results with the bats. Like, would it work, the auditory decoy with the bat?
No, it's not published yet, but it does. They're not influenced by competitive decoys.
Okay.
In the bats, yeah.
And just a second hypothesis, like, would it be a good hypothesis to say that also like acoustic cues could rescue non-salient visual cues, or it just works on one way? Like, visual cues rescue auditory, but could it be like...
You mean other traits in other systems or in the Toomger frogs per se?
Both.
Well, we certainly know in humans that adding, sometimes very arbitrary stimuli can enhance perception or memory. If you're doing audio tests with humans and then you just turn lights on and off while people are learning sounds, the light seems to enhance learning or to enhance discrimination abilities. But there hasn't really been enough studies now as of yet to make any general conclusions. And the reason is that most studies of multimodal communication are asking the question in very different ways. They're assuming that, they're asking what different kinds of information does communication in different modes suggest? So is it redundant, or is it additive, or is it multiplicative? And we're asking the question in a slightly different way. I mean, we're able to reject some of those hypotheses, but we're really more interested in, as the talk this morning too, how the brain is putting these things together.
Yeah, clearly it's come up that several visual cues are at play here. I'm just curious about how the frogs are using visual cues when they're calling at night. Are they using ambient moonlight to see the size of the vocal sac or to see anything else? But also, is there a compromise there? Are the bats that feed on them, these frog-eating bats, do they use visual cues to home in addition to acoustic cues, to home in on the frogs?
Yeah, so the bats, first of all, the frogs are operating under fairly low light levels. And we've done optomotor experiments with the frogs, and we also have unpublished electroretinograms with the frogs now. And they have very good night vision. So they can see the vocal sac inflation. I think our estimate was on 85% of the nights when they're at the breeding site. The bats also are using the vocal sac inflation, but the bats are echo imaging the vocal sac. Our experiments suggest that they're not actually seeing it. They're using their echolocation systems. And we know in other bats, for instance, they can even estimate the size of a moth by echo imaging the rate of wing beats. But what we've also found too is that there's other cues that we weren't aware of that both the bats and the frogs are using. So because the frogs are floating in water, when their vocal sac inflates, they produce these ripples along the water. And we see that the males in their calling behavior respond to ripples, that the ripples enhance the signal that they're receiving. And also, if we dissociate the ripples from the call, then it looks like the males are used, because they travel at different speeds, the males are using the time of arrival differences of the ripple cue and the acoustic cue to range, to estimate how far away the other male is. Very much the way that we can estimate how far away a thunderstorm is we see the lightning and then we count how many seconds until we hear the sound. So that's because, light and sound travel at different speeds. So again, they're able to get information from almost any cue that we can identify as correlated with their sexual displays. And the bats, in case I didn't make that clear, the bats are also using these ripples. And again, echo locating the ripples.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So I have two questions. The first one is, considering that chucks attract more females, but also predators and parasites, were more males using chucks in their singing than not? I'm not sure if you said that, you mentioned it.
Well, if the numbers of chucks increase with the size of the chorus. So the more males that are there, the more chucks that are being produced, everything else being equal. If males are by themselves, they are very, very reluctant to add chucks if they're not competing with any other males. And we think that's because of the high cost, the high predation cost of adding chucks. But also, they're somewhat aware of the local predation risk. So if we fly models of bats over a chorus or over a single frog, then they stop calling right away. And then when they resume calling, they're more reluctant to add chucks than prior to them them seeing the bats. And they're not listening for the bat's echolocation. They can't hear those frequencies, but they can see the silhouette of a bat pass overhead. If a bat flies overhead on very dark nights, then the frogs are unaware of them.
Okay. My second question is, were there any unsuccessful matches in terms of reproductive success? Like, let's say a male would attract a female, but he would not be interested in that female and reject her. Or even homosexual behaviors, a male attracting another male, things like that.
Yeah, we've never seen a male reject a female. That doesn't seem to happen.
Okay.
Some males are more successful than other males. So in most species of frogs, females are larger than males.
Oh,
okay. And as females grow larger, their fecundity increases, the number of eggs increases. Now, when they mate, I had a little video up there of them making a nest. The male gets on the back of the female. Now, if he's really small, and they have external fertilization, when he releases the sperm, it's just going to stay on the female's back. It's not going to fertilize the eggs. Okay. So from the female, and we've shown that the fertilization success increases as males get larger. So if a female ends up with a small male, then she's more likely to have more eggs unfertilized. And we think that the females are really using the chucks to assess body size. If a male's calling by himself, what will happen sometimes is the females will swim in front of the male and keep going and stop and turn around, and then a male will add a chuck. And in some cases, the females will swim into the male and body slam the male, and then quickly back up. And then if the male makes a chuck, she mates with him. If he doesn't make a chuck, she moves on to another male.
And no homosexual behaviors?
No, not that we've ever seen. We've seen mismatings between species. But it would hardly interpret homosexual behavior because males wrestle with one another. So we do see them clasped, but not missionary position, but face to face. So we're pretty sure that's usually fighting.
Thank you.
I'm going to violate the alternation because you've been standing there for a long time.
Oh, thank you. I was just wondering if early life experience were important were as important in the female's choice for a male frog, because we had early this week we had a presentation about songbirds, and females chose their mates because it was similar to the song of their parents. So is that as important in the case of frogs? Because I don't believe that they are raised by a parent.
Was this Sarah Woolley?
Yeah. And also, is there an audience effect in frogs? I mean, do they change their performance based on the number of females, or?
Yeah, well, the answer to the first question is there's no, I mean, we've done the studies. There's no indication that early experience. So unlike songbirds, they don't learn their calls. So we raise them in isolation from when they're tadpoles, where they're only hearing white noise or absolute silence or whines or whine chucks or a different species. And then we test the female's preferences for whine chuck versus whine, and we don't see any difference among the treatments. But on the other hand, not our studies, but in some studies, if you take a female frog as an adult and you expose her to calls of very closely related species with very similar calls, that does influence their mate choice. And we have done experiments like that with fishes, with swordtails, and that it's not early experience, but it's experience right before the mate choice. But in frogs, as I said, they're not, and also too, not our studies, but we do know that the sensitivity of auditory neurons decreases. It becomes more sensitive if they've been listening to a chorus of their own males. So there certainly are experiential effects, but there's no evidence that the sounds that they hear as they're developing as juveniles, unlike those wonderful studies in zebra finches, that kind of early experience is influencing their preferences.
My second question was related to an audience effect. Is there an audience effect in?
Not that we know of.
Okay.
The males can detect the females swimming up to them because the females make ripples. And when the males detect that, they'll start to increase their call rate and their call complexity. But we don't think that they have a perception of how many females might be in the chorus in general, as opposed to whether there's a female, within centimeters of them.
Thank you.
My question is about irrational choice, and I want to introduce it with an old joke from Maine. How's your wife compared to what? There are lots of examples of non-optimal behavior, maximizing versus matching and things like that. When you do your irrational choice experiments, is there a difference between absolute probability of picking an option solo versus in a context of comparison?
If we give females, if I'm understanding the question, Stephen, if we give females a single call, yeah. If it's a conspecific call, then the females will respond to it. So if the female is in reproductive condition. Furthermore, as the night goes on, the females, she's already ovulated before she chooses a male. As the night goes on and her estrogen levels go up, then she will even choose calls that are not. She will even recognize calls that are not conspecific. I mean, there's a paper in Human Psychology years ago. The title was, "Do the girls get prettier at closing time?"
Yeah, I knew it.
And at least the male frogs sound better at closing time to the females. And their closing time is defined by when estrogen gets to a certain level, and whether they're mated or not, the eggs are going to come out.
So my question is also has to do with the title of your speech and the article having to do with irrational choices. Maybe I'm pushing an analogy a bit too far, but usually when we talk about irrational, at least maybe not scientifically, I'm not sure, but usually in the general way of speaking, when we say something is irrational, we refer to emotional. And so what I want to know is, I suppose these frogs probably have something that might look like our emotions, maybe in a much more limited kind of way. Is there any way to study that? Because we're wondering if these beings can actually feel, and I guess emotions would be part of that whole. What do you think?
At the level of behavior, we don't see any good proxies for variation in what we might call emotions. I mean, we have related to that. We have studied the influence of hormones on behavioral variation, both in males and in females. And we know that, for instance, corticosteroids as well as androgen and testosterone do certainly influence the variation in behavior among and also within individuals as those hormone levels change. We're about to begin a study, actually with Sarah Woolley, looking at the effect of the dopamine reward system in the female's preferences, because we do know from our gene expression studies that one of the important nuclei in the dopamine reward system, the VTA, shows a lot more neural activity when females hear attractive calls and when they don't hear attractive calls. But, studying dopamine is not the same as studying the animal's emotions. So We also study fish, and at least from the animals that we have studied, the frogs and the fish, it seems that a fish might be a better system to ask that. In the bats, we feel that we certainly, we think we see things that kind of appear like emotions. There's certainly very strong, I'm not a fan of the term personality, but there's very strong variation amongst individuals over years. Sometimes the folks doing this study, they put little scanner chips in the bats, and they'll catch them 5 years later, and they'll find bats that were very timid in the flight cage 5 years ago appear to be very timid, still very timid. Bats that showed a lot of exploratory behavior 5 years ago, or that were bold 5 years ago, seem to be the same. So with the bats, and also I believe with the fishes, you can ask these questions about personality in the paradigm that at least a lot of behavioral ecologists use, right? Looking at bold and timid and exploratory versus non-exploratory. At least the kinds of studies that we're doing with the Tunga frogs don't really lend itself to asking those questions.
Okay, so far, possibly no emotions in the frogs, or at least not something that meets our criteria.
Yeah, we haven't tried to document it.
Okay.
And not many other people have. But I just want to point out one thing, and I think it was you had asked the question before. We've done a lot of artificial neural network studies with frogs, and one of the speakers who's coming later in this program, Steve Phelps, when Steve was a grad student in my lab, we did an awful lot of artificial neural network studies, and we find that ANNs are very good at predicting the behavior of females. We don't need, I don't remember now, this was a while ago, the number of connections that we had, but it was in the hundreds and not the thousands. So very sparse neural networks made very good predictions about what females would do. And then this allowed us to model the evolution of the female's quote unquote brain to give us a lot of insights. But if we were doing only the artificial neural networks, we would never have, without using an animal reference model, we would never have any idea whether we were on the right track or not.
I see. Well, thank you.
We unfortunately have to finish at 12:30. There's 1 minute left for question and answer.
Okay. I was just wondering if you've tried the competitive decoy test with people's preferences for human faces, or if you would consider doing that.
No, we haven't. This is the study that I showed, which isn't finished yet, is the first study that we've done. So we haven't, and that's a good idea. We haven't done the competitive decoy studies yet. What we're trying to do now is look at. We have a colleague who does eye tracking with peacocks. So now what we're interested in, when you're using ratios to make these comparisons, are there specific traits in the face that people tend to be assessing more than others? And that would be very easy if there are a competitive decoy effect. Then it would be very interesting to know how the subject is actually evaluating these traits and how the competitive decoy will change that. Yeah, that's a really good idea. Thank you.
So we'll end with your very good idea, because we have to stop here, and thank Mike for a really interesting talk.
Thank you. And thank you.